Hello there, so I'm making this video to tell you a little bit about my story. Sometimes people ask me questions like, how did you know you were trans? Why did you transition so much later on in life? And even some friends, not meaning to be, kind of mean or anything, will say, this is just a phase, which I find really interesting because sometimes it comes from people who themselves are different in terms of what we understand as sexual and gender diversity, right? And they have been levelled with that same claim before they came out as gay or lesbian, for example, and it wasn't a phase. So I'm going to keep it as basic as I can. Um, I'm going to try to use language that's accessible and relate it from my own experience because it doesn't connect to all trans or transsexual people's experiences. People have different trajectories, not the same as mine, but I can only really speak about my own awareness, growing awareness, of course, because as a young person you don't necessarily know what's going on. Let's just start in grade 2, okay? So I'm in primary, it's been a year already, but at some point I attempted to join the girls' line in lining up for something, maybe just to get into the classroom. Because so much of a teacher's work is just organisation. And I was told, no, that's not the line for you, and redirected to the boys' line. And I remember feeling really shocked for being called out like that because I spent most of my, recreational time outside of the class, spending time with the girls at an early age. And I really felt like that's where I belonged. I couldn't really relate to the boys. I found them aggressive and with propensities and interests very different from my own. So that's one of the first kinds of awakenings. I have to say, of course, like the question of, what people call gender identity and a mismatch between one's gender identity and assigned sex, or what now gets called biological sex, right? That mismatch feeling kind of came more to the fore during adolescence because that's, if you think about, sexual difference, that includes both primary and secondary sexual characteristics. And for the most part, a prepubescent person doesn't have a huge physical difference from one sex to the other. And so, in a sense, all the gendered meanings of changing bodies and intensification of that set of different definitions around being male and female, they came much more to the fore in adolescence, and that created more conflict for me. But I'll get to that shortly. Before the age of maybe 12, 13, I kind of was blissfully unaware, I should say. I'd love to be blissfully aware that I was, quote unquote, a boy in terms of sex. And that's why it was really like a clash of perspectives and perceptions. I was obviously quite a feminine child, whatever you make of that. I wasn't into rough and tumble. And I just socially felt very alienated from the boys. I didn't like being grouped as a boy, even in the family, and I used to get very upset about that. And it just felt like a form of violence or an imposition on my selfhood. So, that's quite an early set of memories about what didn't fit. But when adolescence began, and I was a bit of a late bloomer, and I was a small kid, still quite, quote unquote, feminine, which meant that sometimes I was picked on as well, actually. The mismatch became much more evident with the onset of puberty. Unwanted changes, as slow as they were, um, my sense of sexuality was not established, not at all. Um, some gay men, for example, or even lesbians, get a really strong sense of, attraction towards one sex or gender and the other, uh, and that can be part of their story. They might have an experience as well, especially gay men. It seems to be part and parcel of their growing realization that they're different. But I didn't feel attraction towards males. Um, I felt like, yeah, like I said, like for the most part, before puberty, relatively genderless, maybe even sexless. But with the onset of puberty, the conflict on a body level became much more prominent. And I really had no language for it. I felt like a complete outsider. Um, I felt like my body was becoming, to put it this way, monstrous, like Frankenstein's monster, and there was nothing that could rein it in. And it only resulted in more kind of gendering as male because of those secondary sex characteristics, which carry a lot of weight, right? So you go from being kind of androgynous and slash feminine, yeah. Um, not saying that necessarily people thought on first blush I was a girl, but it was a different space. And then in terms of puberty, then you kind of get much more that imposition of cultural expectations. Yes, around heterosexuality, but also around being male or female. So the logic for me of sex and sexuality kind of were very much intertwined because I was expected to grow up to be a man and I was expected to grow up to be straight. And there was a lot for me to mentally sort out with both the bodily changes as well as the impositions on me as a person. I had a very early break with my main family unit. I didn't have problems with my siblings, but I did have issues with my parents and with the experience of family violence growing up, and abuse. And so at an early age, having begun to contact or have contact outside of the suburb I lived in with a group called ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, I met other gays and lesbians, and I began to think, well, I must be gay, right? And this is after my first kind of teenage relationship, which was with a girl. But I had no real attractions. I just felt like powerfully outside of the kinds of expectations I spoke to before, which is about sex and reproductive sexuality, in particular heterosexuality. So it seemed logical to me that I must be gay. And I came out to my mother. That did not go down well at all. And I also disclosed that I'd been abused by the main male caretaker or guardian. Yeah, that also created a huge ripple effect, particularly because people didn't know how to respond, but also in my biological father's family. People wanted to disown me and told me that I wasn't welcome in their house, that I was a liar, and all those sorts of things. And so I really was set with a lot of challenges in my late teens and early 20s, around the time of, like increasing depression around my developing body and all the memories around abuse and violence. I just wanted to drop out. I felt really like at a dead end and really stuck. And the solution to me was to kind of let it rip and speak the truth and then have to face the consequences, which was effectively not being able to have family support and having to run away. So by the time I was in my early 20s, I found myself living in Melbourne with no financial support from either parent. I wasn't in touch with them. I felt like I was in shell shock and I felt really angry as well. I couldn't really get support from sexual assault services. I entered into periods of homelessness and also tried to resolve that with squatting when there wasn't the avenue of housing support, although I did have some of that as well for a period. There was a lot of instability, but there's also an attempt to define myself and express myself. Um, and I was also opened up to the possibility that it was possible to be wrongly assigned and also to be trans as well as transgender. The earlier discourses around transsexuality I was also familiar with even before I left my hometown and cut off from family, especially parents, or mainly parents. Uh, but it was extremely stigmatized then in the 80s, and I only knew one transsexual young person, and they detransitioned eventually as well. I mean, they made a big impression on me and they showed me that it was possible, but things were tough back then, and you couldn't just have gender affirmative care like by going to see a gender GP or someone like that. They had specific gender clinics in hospitals, and in my small town, not many. There would have been pretty much one. And this individual who was, transitioning, they would have had to be put through the real life test and not even given hormones in the first year, in order to qualify and undergo extensive psychological assessment. Um, so that wasn't available to me as a 15-year-old, but they were in my world, and so I mentally knew that it was possible, but like even though interestingly enough my mom embraced this individual, the kind of expectation to be a boy was so strong and foisted on me that even though I tried to rebel against that as well, especially when I was being shoehorned into boys' brigade and refused to go, didn't want to be with adult men, didn't want to be with other boys because I wasn't really a boy, right? Fundamentally. But I really found it hard to make that claim because all evidence suggested otherwise. And expectations around the same. So it's only really when I break with family, especially parental influence and authority, that I begin to explore, that my reality is not that of becoming a man. But it was only the early 90s. There weren't that many services, and definitely gender affirmative care, as we know it now, was not the framework. Um, so much like that family friend who had to undergo the real life test and get lots of psychological assessment, that's the path that I was going to have to face. But in even attempting to socially transition, cross live as we used to call it, I faced a lot of turbulence socially, including attempts to physically assault me, harassment in the street, on public transport, and all of that co-occurred at the time of housing instability. I knew and was friends with one transsexual young woman who got fired from her job in a pub because she was physically changing, and the boss said that's unacceptable. And they ended up like having no option but to move to Sydney and live in King's Cross, and I assume get involved in the world of the sex trade. That's not foreign to me either. That was part of my existence around that period. But so much of my image of myself and who I should be was also from earlier years, and also the experience of being exploited sexually by an older man. Really, it was very hard for me to work out my sexuality. I did have and gender. I did have a safe relationship with another male, and I probably had 3 in my whole life. So I haven't just had relationships with men, right? but it provided a bit of a refuge, especially at that initial relationship. But the feelings of incongruence around my sex did not go away. Um, and also, I was not highly motivated to embrace, quote unquote, the gay scene. I felt like an alien in those spaces as well. That persisted. And that was really hard to articulate to people around me as well. So my attempts at social transition in the 90s kind of stopped because of the threat of violence. And I'd already experienced that growing up. And my gender variance was also kind of used against me, especially by my abuser, and became a topic of contention, a problem. So lots of ways in which I was shamed, yeah? I only really began to emerge from that when I had a good, long, hard look at what I'd been through, yeah, with all the backdrop of family violence and sexual abuse. Began to heal from some of that, but not entirely. But also had a safer and well set up life to actually start transition medically. But again, like a long road, a really long road. And sorting out sex and gender from sexuality is also part of it, right? So now at this stage of my life, I get it. I get that I can be female and with this kind of presentation and a lesbian. Like I didn't, all the cables were crossed, the wires were all messy, including probably in my head. But it really became clear to me that my first relationship, which, I was into this this young woman, we were both 15. It wasn't that I didn't want to pursue it further because of being gay, it's because I wasn't comfortable with my body the way it was developing, and I didn't want to be cast in that role as being a heterosexual male. So, that's what takes a lot of untethering because the cultural discourses say otherwise. So being really honest, right? And now I'm at a stage in my life, ironically, after a lot of study academically and also self-analysis, where, like obviously I've written so much about trans existence and representations of trans people. I've always been part of the milieu, but it really clicked for me when I realised that the relationship I was in with a male was not working, and that all the sort of bodily based dysphoria came back with a big jolt, and then I knew what to do. We're living in a different period, and gender affirmative care, although under challenge, exists. I have had extensive therapy, and oftentimes we have worked on the issue of dysphoria, so it's not like I was self-diagnosing or whatever, but I was able to step in to a GP gender specialist office and nearly 2 years ago begin the process of medical transition. So yeah, it's a labyrinth really, but I feel better than ever, and I think the first sign for me was when I was beginning to develop exactly those secondary sexual characteristics that go with puberty, but in this case a female puberty, with HRT, and seeing my body, seeing myself in the mirror, seeing the changes here and also in my face, fat shape and redistribution of fat, and realizing, oh my god, for the first time I can see clearly. That is me. So if it's really hard to get your head around these things, whether you're trans or not, that's the simplest way for me to explain it. Maybe you relate, maybe you don't. I never had episodes in growing up where I just had a sort of desire or an erotic charge to cross-dress. None of that at all. But I didn't feel comfortable with boys. I didn't feel like I belonged in that context. And then with puberty, the challenges of being in a body that was developing in that direction were just absolutely torture. There's no two ways about it. And that never went away. I always felt like I was screening myself out and playing a role, right? That my body was betraying me, really. It's hard to explain. I did my best to live that way, and also uh, find tenderness in encounters with men because that was becoming more and more socially possible. But then I really hit a sort of wall recently, like a couple of years ago, where it all came flooding back, and I realised that it was kind of like a processing error for me to have mistaken, you know, uh, what is sexuality for sex and gender, and then, when that really dawned on me, I realised as well that I'm not even really, attracted to men. That was just a sort of makeshift way of trying to understand myself and be in the world. So a lot of evolution, yeah, it's an ongoing process, believe me. Thanks for listening.